These scandals involving the justices have caused public opinion to question the court's fairness and independence that are essential to faithfully carrying out its mission of equal justice under the law. And today I'm calling for 3 bold reforms to restore trust and accountability to the court and our democracy.
President Biden has announced sweeping reforms for the U.S. Supreme Court. More on that later, but first, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump is talking about controversial comments he made last week, urging Christians to vote for him in November, saying if they do, they'll never have to vote again. Some Democrats say it's yet another example of the threat Trump poses to democracy. Some Republicans claim it's merely Trump stressing the importance of the election with his typical flair. The Hill White House reporter Brett Samuels joins us to discuss. Brett, Trump went on Fox News last night and was asked about those comments. What did he say?
Yeah, so to your point, Drew, this is sort of the latest instance of the former president, sort of taking things right up to the edge, where he's sort of flirting with this idea of, eroding democratic norms, as Democrats might put it, this idea that there will be no more elections in 4 more years if he wins, as Democrats have argued. Now, when he was asked about this on Fox, he really didn't do much to sort of address the backlash or to push back on the idea that that's what he was saying. His argument was that he was merely stressing the importance of voting to Christians, a group that he says does not typically vote in great numbers in presidential elections. But Laura Ingraham, the Fox News host, was sort of repeatedly trying to give him an out here to say that, he wasn't saying that there would be no more elections. He wasn't saying, that he would be an autocrat if he's elected. And instead, he just kept stressing this idea that Christians needed to get out and vote. So it's just sort of the latest example, I think, of Trump sort of flirting with this rhetoric, sort of flirting with, talk of being more of an authoritarian without really directly pushing back on it. So it's sort of a case of people can kind of make what they want out of his comments.
Not all Democrats are taking those comments to be an assault on democracy. Former Biden communications director Kate Bedingfield said she did not think Trump meant his victory would be an end to elections. That caused a backlash online. Brett, it seems like sometimes liberals struggle with how far to go with their rhetoric against Trump.
For sure. I think it's one of those things where when former President Trump is sort of constantly saying controversial things, constantly sort of walking up to the edge in talking about things like this, where, he sort of hints at the idea of making sweeping changes to government, it's hard for Democrats to decide, what is sort of a 5-alarm fire and what is just a comment that needs to be, maybe pushed back on, but not turned into a whole news cycle. So I think it's one of those things, as Kate Bedingfield, the former Biden White House official, was pointing out, it's one of those things where I think Democrats need to kind of pick their battles, decide what are comments from former President Trump that truly merit outrage and truly merit sort of an all-hands-on-deck response, and what are comments that are sort of just Trump, pushing people's buttons and maybe looking to elicit a response like this.
President Biden has announced a plan to reform the U.S. Supreme Court. The proposal would institute term limits for justices and implement a code of ethics for the court. Biden also proposes a constitutional amendment to overturn the court's decision, granting broad immunity from criminal prosecution to former presidents. Republicans are blasting the proposals as an attack on the high court's independence. Former Attorney General Bill Barr co-authored an op-ed warning that these reforms could actually be implemented if Democrats win both chambers of Congress and hold the White House. What's he saying?
Yeah, so, Bill Barr's op-ed is sort of one of many Republican criticisms of this proposal from President Biden, sort of getting at this idea that if Democrats control Congress, they would, get rid of the filibuster or propose legislation to make these sort of sweeping reforms. Now, some Republicans have raised the idea that Democrats would also look to expand the Supreme Court, and that's not something that President Biden has proposed here. That's not something that he has said he supports at any point. But these other 3 reforms, enacting a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, enacting term limits of 18 years for Supreme Court justices, and then that amendment concerning presidential immunity, those are things that President Biden feels very strongly about, especially in the wake of some of the controversial Supreme Court rulings when it comes to overturning Roe v. Wade, overturning affirmative action, and then, of course, granting wide presidential immunity in the case of former President Trump. That has sort of spurred this proposal from President Biden. But, Bill Barr wrote this op-ed. Speaker Mike Johnson called this proposal dead on arrival. And with a divided Congress in an election year, there's almost no chance of this passing before November. And even beyond that, once President Biden is out of the White House, it's unclear how much momentum this proposal will really have. So it's hard to really see this as much beyond sort of a messaging exercise from President Biden to sort of put this out there and force Republicans to take a position on it.
We're hearing more second guessing from congressional Republicans over the pick of J.D. Vance to be the party's vice presidential nominee. Brett, last week we reported on Republicans in the House questioning the wisdom of picking Vance. Now we're hearing from senators. What are they saying?
Yes, senators, much like House Republicans, are sort of divided over how smart of a pick it was by former President Trump to tap J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, to join him on the ticket in November. I think there is sort of an awareness among Senate Republicans in particular that former President Trump is not going to abandon J.D. Vance. He's not going to change his mind. Trump has said as much. He said that he thinks Vance is doing a fantastic job, that he's appealing to donors, he's appealing to voters. So there really doesn't seem to be any kind of major groundswell to actually replace J.D. Vance. I think what we're seeing is really just kind of a response to what could charitably just be described as sort of a rocky first week or 10 days on the ballot for J.D. Vance. He's had a lot of old comments resurfaced where he's criticizing, women without children as sort of childless cat ladies, as he put it. Old comments being resurfaced. He's sort of had some awkward moments on the campaign trail. So I think this is a case of J.D. Vance sort of struggling to find his footing right out of the gate. And Republicans are concerned about that and whether a different choice might have been sort of a smoother rollout, would have appealed to more voters. But, at this point, it just seems like the Trump campaign is going to ride this out, and they feel like J.D. Vance will kind of find his sea legs and get more comfortable on the trail as we go along.
Not to be outdone by white women for Kamala Harris, 190,000 people joined a white men for Harris Zoom call Monday night. The call featured top contenders to be Harris's VP pick, including Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Celebrities like actors Jeff Bridges and Mark Hamill also joined the call. Now, it's no surprise that Harris has support of high-profile Dems in Hollywood, but the vibes do seem to be pretty good in the Democratic Party, and it's translating to a flood of cash. $4 million were raised during the white guys call. What are Democrats going to do with all this money?
Yeah, well, it's much needed money. I think it's fair to say. The Harris campaign, they touted that in just the first week after President Biden stepped aside and endorsed Vice President Harris to be the next Democratic nominee. In the week following that, the Harris campaign said they raised more than $200 million. You pointed to these sort of grassroots calls that are raising millions of dollars. And it's a much needed shot in the arm, I think, for the Harris campaign because, in the past month or so following that June presidential debate, Democratic donors were kind of closing their wallets. They were a little less willing to give to the Biden campaign to fill up those campaign coffers. So, at that point, it seemed like the Trump campaign had basically overtaken the Biden campaign when it comes to campaign cash. So this big fundraising boost, I think, is a sign, one, of sort of the grassroots momentum and enthusiasm around Vice President Harris, around the sort of changing ticket. So that certainly revitalized Democrats. And then specifically on the money, it will be used to roll out campaign ads. We're already seeing a $50 million ad buy from the Harris campaign ahead of the Democratic convention in August. And certainly they'll be using that money to flood the airwaves and to build up infrastructure in battleground states, which were things that it was no guarantee they'd be able to do had President Biden stayed atop the ticket.
Let's talk about polling. Since taking over as the presumptive Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris has been doing better in polls than President Biden before he dropped out of the race. Right now, pollsters essentially see a tie between Harris and Trump. I guess the question is there room for Harris to keep improving, or do we stay in this statistical dead heat area where that would suggest a nail-biter of an election in November?
Yeah, I think the latter is the more likely scenario with this sort of closely contested election in November. It's hard to see, just given the polarization in the country, people's sort of entrenched views on former President Trump in particular. It's hard to see a scenario where one candidate pulls, vastly far away from the other, especially when there's basically 6 battleground states that are going to decide the election in November. When you look at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. So I think the polls, certainly it's good news for Democrats in the sense that these polls are showing a very tight race, because before President Biden got out of the race, it was showing former President Trump actually, pulling into sort of comfortable territory where he was up by a few percentage points in each of those states. So, Democrats and Republicans, both sides have said this is going to be a really close election. And I think even with the enthusiasm around Vice President Harris, these polls are reflective of that we are in for really a close election that will just be decided by a few different states.
Kamala Harris is heading to Georgia today for a rally that will feature Georgia's two Democratic senators, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, and Stacey Abrams, the former gubernatorial candidate who's been instrumental in recent Democratic successes in the Peach State. Do Democrats think they can recreate the mojo that was so successful in 2020 with Harris now at the top of the ticket?
Yeah, I think Democrats certainly feel like they have a better chance of recreating that magic than they did a couple months ago, when enthusiasm about President Biden and his candidacy was sort of floundering, especially in a state like Georgia, where black voters in particular really helped propel President Biden to winning that state in 2020. Obviously, Vice President Harris, polling has shown that she appeals more to black voters than President Biden did. So that could certainly play a factor in Georgia, where that demographic is going to be really significant. And just the fact that she's going to Atlanta for this rally, it'll be, just her second official campaign event since she became the likely nominee. I think the fact that she's holding this event in Georgia just shows that Democrats do feel like they have a chance to repeat and win the state in November like they did in 2020, whereas President Biden had not been to Georgia in several months. So, the fact that Harris is spending her time and the campaign is spending its resources there, I think is reflective of how they feel about their chances in November.
So we're talking a lot about the good vibes surrounding the Harris campaign, but she does face big challenges. Republicans are sure to attack liberal policy positions she's taken in the past. She has a tough choice on who to pick as vice president, and polls show she still trails Trump in some key swing states. Is the honeymoon phase going to end as we get closer to the election?
Yeah, certainly Democrats would love if the honeymoon lasted just 100 days, from the time Vice President Harris became the likely nominee to Election Day. But of course, that's not going to happen. There will be bumps in the road, certainly when Vice President Harris chooses her running mate. There will be all kinds of, potential backlash or criticism, or people will resurface old clips like we're seeing with J.D. Vance on the Republican side, whether she picks Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly of Arizona, whoever it may be. And already we're seeing Republicans really go on offense, particularly on the issue of immigration. They're labeling Vice President Harris the border czar, a reference to her work addressing root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle for the Biden administration. Already the Trump campaign, their first attack ad against Harris is over immigration. J.D. Vance is going to the border this week to highlight the issue of immigration. So certainly we'll see the attacks ramp up. We'll see how Vice President Harris responds when the headlines are not all rosy and, sort of about the new sense of enthusiasm in the Democratic Party. But certainly I think Democrats still will take that and will take sort of the initial wave of excitement over how they were feeling just a couple of weeks ago.
Weird. That's the new buzzword Democrats are using to describe Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance and Republicans more broadly. Brett, I don't know if this was focus grouped or what, but it is something that all the Democrats are repeating. Where did this come from, and what do you think it says about Democratic messaging?
So the first person who seemingly sort of widely used this was Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, who has sort of rapidly risen up the short list of potential running mates for Vice President Harris. He went on TV and he said that these Republicans, Trump and J.D. Vance, are just weird people, as he put it, referring to some of their policy proposals, but also referring to some of these old comments by J.D. Vance about quote unquote childless cat ladies running the country. So, he seemed to pick up the ball and the rest of the party has run with it, attacking Republicans as weird, calling Trump weird, calling Vance weird, calling their policy proposals weird. And it does seem to have caught on. And I think it's reflective of this idea that maybe this sort of more casual, colloquial messaging that maybe more Americans can relate to maybe resonates better than some of the more maybe rigid sort of DC talk about, threats to democracy, or talking about specific policy, sort of niche policy things that might be enacted. Democrats will continue to talk about those things, but I think this argument of Republicans are just weird is something that Democrats clearly think has caught on and is a way to just sort of level with everyday Americans and everyday voters about what they see as the contrast in this election.
Pete Buttigieg is everywhere. The transportation secretary and former Democratic presidential candidate has been storming the airwaves, making the case for Kamala Harris. He's seen as a highly effective communicator for Democratic policies, so much so that some think he would be a good choice to be Harris's VP. Do you think he has a shot of actually getting picked?
Well, I think the argument for Pete Buttigieg as Harris's running mate is exactly what you said, this idea that he is maybe the best communicator in the Democratic Party. He goes on Fox News regularly, he spars with hosts there, and he's able to deliver talking points. He's able to, spin around their questions, go on offense against Republicans. This is his ability to communicate is really what helped catapult him into the national spotlight during his 2020 presidential bid. But that being said, I don't think that Pete Buttigieg is at the top of the short list. He may be on the short list, and he's certainly being vetted to join the ticket. But I think that the Harris campaign is far more likely to choose somebody like a Josh Shapiro, like a Mark Kelly, even like a Tim Walz, somebody who maybe expands their ability to communicate with voters on different issues, as opposed to just tapping somebody who is another Biden administration official and maybe doesn't expand Harris's appeal too much beyond what she can already do herself.
It's primary day today in Arizona. Republican Kari Lake is expected to cement her spot as the Republican candidate for Senate. The same goes for Congressman Ruben Gallego on the Democratic side. Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance will campaign in the state today. How crucial is Arizona in determining the balance of power in the Senate and the winner of the presidential race?
Certainly, yeah, Arizona is going to be a really pivotal state, as it seems to be every few years. It's going to be a really pivotal state in November. As you mentioned, there will be this hotly contested Senate race between Kari Lake and Ruben Gallego. And as you said, the primary today will kind of cement that. Former President Trump held a tele-rally in support of Lake on the day before the primary. As you mentioned, J.D. Vance will be out there campaigning. So, certainly Republicans are putting a lot of eggs in this basket. They've sort of cleared the field for Kari Lake, despite the fact that she lost her gubernatorial bid just a couple of years ago to a Democrat. And then on the presidential side, certainly Arizona is one of those 6 states I mentioned that will almost certainly determine the winner in November of the presidential race when you factor in Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia as well. So, the fact that primary day is here, that we're already seeing some activity from presidential candidates who are going to the state to campaign, I think is a sign of how important they view this state already a few months out from the election.
Speaking of Arizona, the Republican mayor of Mesa is bucking his party and endorsing Kamala Harris for president. John Giles, who is mayor of Phoenix's largest suburb, says the GOP has become a party of extremism with Trump at the helm. In a crucial state like Arizona, could this endorsement make a difference?
Certainly, I think from the Harris campaign's perspective, every little bit helps. They have been really trumpeting this endorsement. Anytime they can get a registered Republican sort of on the record to say that they're supporting the Democrat for president, I think that's something that the Harris campaign is keen to highlight. We've seen them do that with Nikki Haley voters who maybe support Vice President Harris. So certainly they're going to trumpet this. It could certainly make a difference in a state like Arizona, where maybe just 10 or 20,000 votes are going to be the difference in the presidential race. So certainly I think the Harris campaign will be touting this. We'll be hearing more from this mayor. The Harris campaign will likely be eager to elevate them. But again, Arizona is shaping up to be one of the most closely watched and closely contested states heading into November.
All right, that's all I got. Brett Samuels, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
New York Comptroller Brad Lander has launched a campaign to oust Mayor Eric Adams. Lander announced his campaign to run against Adams in next year's primary race, saying it's time for strong, experienced leadership that delivers real results. Back in 2021, Lander won his election for the city comptroller, but now has his sights on becoming mayor. He is one of 2 other Democrats to announce primary bids against Adams. Tesla recalls more than 1.8 million cars because of a hood issue. The electric car giant announced the recall over software failures that detect if the hood is unlatched. raising the risk of a crash. Back in June, Tesla began updating software to fix the issue, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The recall affects the Tesla Model 3, S, and X manufactured between 2021 and 2024, along with Model Ys between 2020 and 2024. This is the biggest recall for Tesla since late last year, when the automaker recalled over 2 million cars to install new safeguards in its autopilot system. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has announced a $1.4 billion settlement with Meta over its collection of Texans' biometric identifiers. Paxton sued Meta, the parent company of Facebook, back in 2022, alleging the company used facial recognition to automatically tag users in photos without disclosing how the feature worked. The use of biometric identifiers is illegal under Texas law, which prohibits companies from capturing information such as retina, fingerprints, or hand geometry unless the person is informed and provides consent. The $1.4 billion settlement is the largest ever obtained from an action brought by a single state. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.